Ready? Okay. Gimel Tamuz is really an extremely challenging day. We all know what the Rebbe said in the Sichos, and we all know what we believe. But since we are Yidden, and Yidden means that this is an Am Chochem V'Novim. Chochem V'Novim means it's a wise and understanding nation. Yidden are a nation that are Ma'aminim b'nei Ma'aminim. On the one hand, they have the nature, and they're imbued with Emunah, and Emunah comes easy to them. And at the same time, we say that there is it's a nation of the wise and learned. What this means that if you have a combination of Emunah with wisdom, it means that while it is a pure Emunah, and Emunah by definition is something that wisdom cannot capture, cannot really understand. On the other hand, somehow this Emunah has to make sense. We have a wise way of relating to it. In other words, while we were directed, we were commanded to learn and to understand, the Torah says that you should learn Torah because kihi chochmaschem uvinaschem. This is your wisdom and this is your source of understanding. And then at the same time, we have Emunah of principles that are beyond understanding. These two things cannot be contradictory, meaning it cannot be that when I am wise and I understand, then I'm not capable of having Emunah, and when I'm involved in Emunah, then I'm not capable of understanding. I can only have Emunah if I completely cancel out my wise part and say that at this moment I am not wise at all. At this moment I accept things as a fool. Yidden are never fools. Yidden are never fools. Whether it is when they are learning or when they are going beyond that which can be learned and they talk in terms of Emunah. Under normal circumstances, these two things are somehow combined by, in fact, putting them in two separate buckets. But when it comes to a day like Gimel Tamuz, which in practical terms, to the naked eye, and not only to the naked eye, but even to anything that makes sense, it is completely contrary to the emunah that we ourselves are saying. Then it becomes a challenge. And the purpose of this challenge, like every challenge, is to get into the depth of it and understand and relate to emunah along with chokhmah, along with wisdom. So that, yes, I believe something that I cannot explain, but you know something, it makes sense. And when you say it makes sense, it is not only that it makes sense because I have sources for it. I know the Rebbe said it. I was taught by my mashpim. I learned about it, but it makes sense to me. I can relate to it. It's not something that causes me any kind of internal contradiction. This aspect in Jewish life is really imperative. It is really very important. One of the greatest principles that distinguish our emunah, Jewish emunah, from any other emunah, quote unquote, is precisely this. When it comes to emunah, anyone in the street can come up with any kind of an idea and he says, I believe it. But that belief simply means I choose to believe it. And this is how I want to think. Jewish emunah is a true emunah. In other words, it's emunah in the sense that I have the kelim, I have the means with which to believe in it, whereby while I believe, I am not losing my status as an intelligent person. And I can easily combine the two. In Loshen Chachomim, the Chachomim throughout the ages refer to various emunas. It's called emunas tfeilos. Emunas tfeilos, emunas that do not really represent anything of a human soul, any kind of a depth of insight. It's tfeilos. Throughout the ages, there were people, even today, to some extent, there is what's called Avodah Zarah. People believed in stone, people believed in forms, and in all kinds of different things. It made absolutely no sense. Besides that, it didn't make any sense. It actually reduced them to fools. The Gemara says, and I'm sure you all learned, that there were the Arvayim that came to Avraham Avinu, when Avraham was sitting outside of his tent, looking for a guest. So he told them to wash their feet before they entered his tent, because the Arvayim used to actually bow to the Ovok Shal Ragleim, to the dust on their feet. How they ever came up with this kind of a convoluted and this kind of full of a imaginary power when they came up with it. And once they came up with it, they actually believed in it. So clearly, when we say emunah, we do not mean that I stubbornly subscribe to a certain idea. It doesn't have to make sense. I don't have to argue about it. I don't have to explain myself. This is how I want to think. That's not emunah Yisrael. This is not the emunah of the wise. What is in fact the principle of emunah? In essence, the first principle of emunah is something that we have already discussed over these months. The first principle of emunah comes from the fact that we have a soul, we have a neshama. What does that mean in simple terms? What this means is, contrary to what may appear superficially, and some modern thinkers actually, modern thought actually subscribes to it, that all that a person knows is essentially the result of his experience. And how various experiences have pushed him to make certain conclusions and make certain assumptions and create certain ideas. And that's how a person views things. And we totally and categorically disagree with this. And we say that no, there is a soul in the person. What that means is that regardless of his experience, at the moment when a person is born, he knows something. And what does he know? The neshama, the soul, knows the absolute truth. And that's what the neshama truly actually represents. The neshama, as the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, is a chelek elokah mimal. It's actually representative of God. It's a godly soul. What does this mean, it's a godly soul? It means that it recognizes and it has the sense without knowing how to identify it, how to elaborate on it, how to define it and explain it. But it knows that there is the Rebbeinu Shalom, that there is a God. That it knows intuitively. How does it know it? Because life itself is representative of that. This is what its life is. What this means, clearly, no matter how much we're going to talk about it, we will not really be able to pinpoint and understand the neshama. But we will be able to draw upon it and go a step further and say that every person recognizes deep down, not from his experience, but from his very essence, he recognizes deep down that there is a truth and that there is significance to living. Life is not just an experience. what you experience, whether you like the chocolate or you don't. There is real truth, there is real value to it. This comes from the neshama. And thus, emunah is actually rooted in this essence that is really is the basic essence of the person. That when a person is involved in the practical world, he sees the practical world, the measurable parts. But deep down, something is always telling him what is really behind it. This is referring to emunah. Emunah is a real consciousness that is always present in the person. And what does this consciousness tell him? It tells him that the world that you are observing is only the surface. It's not the real thing. What does it mean it's only the surface, it's not the real thing? It means that even though on the surface things work and the world seems to be able to work itself out in a logical way, the real reason why it all works is not because it's all logical and all fits in, but because there is a soul in the world that the logical format of the world represents. To make it more clear, this is a reference back to something that we've discussed in the past. That by observation, we only see that the sun rises and the sun sets. And logically and scientifically we say that it means that there is a rotation, whether it's the sun rotating or it's the earth rotating around its axis. It's immaterial. The point is that there is a physical rotation that causes day and night, light and darkness. And from this perspective, light and darkness represents absolutely nothing except light and dark. What you make of it is your own doing, is your own imagination. From the perspective of the world, there's nothing there. It's just, there is some kind of a natural rotation, whatever causes it to be, and that's how it happens. But deep down in our souls, we discuss this from the Torah and so forth, but in every neshama, in every human being, when one observes this, the huge world, and sees the perfect organization, orderliness, the continuous sequence of events and so forth, he will recognize that there is something more to it, that it's not rotating accidentally. There is some significance to it. Why will he recognize it? Because he has a neshama. Physically, he doesn't see it. Physically, he only sees the physical rotation. So he cannot measure it. But he recognizes there is something more to it. The Gemara says that this was in fact the very first conclusion that Avraham Avinu came to. Avraham Avinu was observing the rotation of the Galgalim, rotation of the universe, and he says, It's inconceivable that this orderly rotation is without a rotator, without anyone in control. How can there be a fully developed edifice, a fully developed city without an organizer? So, in this aspect it's alone, there are two things. One is the logical conclusion that there has to be something behind it. And the other is infinitely more important. The other is not that there has to be something behind it, but I actually recognize that there is something behind it. These are two very different aspects. The reason that I recognize that there is something behind it is because from a neshama perspective, I do not look at it from a physical approach. From a neshama perspective, I look at it from a significance, from a meaning approach to start with. What does it mean that there is a world? What does it mean that there is such a perfect cycle? This is inherent in a person's mind. This is inherent in a person's emunah. In other words, it's unshakable. You don't need any substantiation, any proof. It's unshakable in a person's mind that there is meaning to the world, although there is nothing he can prove about it. This is because he has a soul, not because of his experience, but because this is the way, to start with, this is the way he recognizes things. Thus, to summarize, emunah simply means that we have a capacity, we have a certain level of our consciousness where we recognize truth that is beyond the observable, not dependent on the physical, not dependent on what we observe, but that which we inherently recognize, inherently know to be. On this, coming back to Gimel Tamuz, in our experience, in human experience, the superficial occurrence of Gimel Tamuz is one of the most categorical and extreme and conclusive events. This is how the physical, how we know it in the world. That when a thing like this occurs, this means that this is inclusive, an end of story. And yet, we come back and we say that this which we see is only because this is an appearance, something just appears like this. But in truth, it's not like that. What does it mean in truth it's not like that? Where does it come from? What does it mean? In truth, it's not like that. There has to be some. How do you relate to that? Especially in occurrence of this extreme categorical categorical cutoff, so to speak. It's the end. That's the way the world knows it. And we say, no, it's only observation. It's not the real thing. You have to be able to relate to it. What does it mean? It means that we know and we relate to the truth of the world and truth of existence and truth of life from a different perspective completely. Not from fact, from experience, but from a standpoint of emunah. How does this translate? It translates in the first following, and this is probably going to reveal the point. There are two ways to interpret every one of our observations. The first and simple and physical point is that something exists because it makes sense that it exists from itself. It's a physical object, and physical object just exists. The other is that if something exists, it is because it is made to exist. It doesn't exist on itself. It is made to exist. Just as we said before, that if there is a rotation, there's a day and night, you could look at it as it's there, it just happens. And you can look at it as it's something that is being made to happen.
So the first could not be existent?
I'm sorry?
So the first way you look at it, that thing could really not be existent? Because it's just up to your perception. You're saying the second thing it's made to exist, and the first one not?
The first one means that it exists only at the level of the fact. And the second one means that it exists because there is a truth that makes it happen. It has to be that way. In the past, we have discussed this from various perspectives. That if you know something only because of observation, that means that its existence is true only because you cannot deny it. Not because it makes sense, not because it has to be there. But just because it's something which, to your eyes tell you it's there. Let me explain it on a more physical level. For a person to be convinced that a physical object is there, what does it mean that he is convinced a physical object is there? It means that if he should want to walk across this physical object, there's something going to be stopping him. He won't be able to go across. This convincing him that it's there. This means that you know it from the fact, from the physical. Knowing it from a perspective of value has a totally different criteria. I have described it in the past. I thought that I wouldn't have to go into this. I described it in the past as follows: that when you observe a setup, you come into a party where there are tables and chairs and settings set up. The first thing that you see is not the fact that there are tables and chairs. You see immediately that there is something happening. There's a party happening. So you're relating to the purpose, to what's behind it, what made it happen, rather than what you see happening. We discussed this. We said, how does a human being relate to this different than an animal? How? To an animal, this is just plain wood. A human being sees its significance right away. In other words, he sees the reality behind it. Okay, this is what I'm referring to. So, this reality behind it, there are different levels in this. There is what we said, Seichel Anushi, and then there is Seichel Alaki, and then there is Emunah. Emunah means that you can relate to a truth because you see that there is truth to it. Emunah is an inherent part of a Yidden, regardless of what the degree or how much he learned, what is his degree of even Shmir Torah. There is a story that I personally know that my son is a shliach in Long Island, and he went into a agency, advertising agency. He needed some services from them, and the head of the agency was a woman, apparently intelligent woman, and he came into her, and lo and behold, she has the Rebbe's picture right there in her office, a big Rebbe's picture. A picture of the Rebbe. So they were talking, and among the things that she said, people like that don't die. This is not a Mashiachist. People like that don't die. What does it mean, people like that? To her, she doesn't know anything about it. But Mitzad the Emunah, you could see that there is something different in the life, in this life, than the physical life that you can observe. This comes because we have an insight, and the insight is that although that there is a world, and the world has its limits, and it runs according to certain rules, this is only the surface. The real force behind the world is something that is completely higher than the world, and unlimited, and unrelated, and not bound by worldly rules. And this is why we could say that if in the world something appears one way, but the truth, which means what is in essence it's completely different. And the reason we can relate to essence is because we have a neshama, because we have a perception that there is a truth that is not measured by one of the criteria. This is where we interrelate and we don't find contradiction between intellect and the moon. There's a long letter from the Rebbe where people, in the early years, people asked the Rebbe all kinds of questions about the seeming contradiction between Torah and science. It's going back in the 50s. And there's a long letter from the Rebbe about this, touching upon various points. And there's one very critical principle that the Rebbe says. The Rebbe says that we have to understand that science deals with the relative truth, while Torah deals with absolute truth. What is the meaning of these two statements? What is the meaning of an absolute truth? And what is the meaning of a relative truth?
When the relation goes away, the truth changes.
I'm sorry?
When the relation changes, the truth also changes. That's right. In relation to something else.
Yeah. But this is only if you could see it go away. But if something does not go away, the sun rotates continuously, you don't see it go away. In what way is this a relative truth?
The truth that depends on the sun rotation.
I'm sorry?
The truth that depends on what you see. You see the sun rotating, so you make a truth depending on the sun rotating.
Yeah. So why is that a relative truth? This doesn't change.
There's going to be something above the sun, beyond the sun.
Why? I'm saying, where you don't see it, right? Why is it called a relative?
It's relative to our perception.
I'm sorry?
It's relative to our perception.
Relative to our perception, that's correct. But in to capture it, it's a correct answer. But I want to explain it. Relative means that I see it happen, although everything that happens has to have a reason why it happens. And if it doesn't have a reason, then I, as a human being, am missing something. Why is it happening? But I have to accept it. It's happening. Which means, relative, in other words, means it's a truth up to a certain level. At what level? At the observable level. In terms of my observation, this is true. But in terms of my beliefs, in terms of my insights, in terms of what I believe a truth requires, I don't see it. This book is here. There's absolutely no reason why it's here. It could be here. This is called a relative truth, which means it just happens to be there. At the level of my observation, that's all it is. An absolute truth means that I could see that it has to be that way. This means absolute. In terms of this absolute truth, there are many levels. The first level is that there is a reason for it. It has a purpose. But that also is not the ultimate absolute. The ultimate absolute is that this represents Hashem's will. this was created by Hashem, and Hashem created in a certain way because that represents the truth of His will. This is where the absolute comes in, which means that this is no longer, there's no longer a further criteria, no longer further question as to why, what's behind it, because that is self-evident. That represents the ultimate truth. Hashem creates it that way. It represents a godly purpose, a godly meaning. So, the union of Emunah Yisrael means not that I believe what you tell me. Emunah means that I recognize that there is an absolute truth. I recognize that there is real meaning in life. Not meaning that that I've done a good thing and people will praise me for it. But that there is an ultimate and unlimited good, an unlimited purpose. That's what I'm doing. And this is why we can have a movement and believe in things that are completely contradictory to our observation, while at the same time be perfectly intelligent and practical people. There's no contradiction whatsoever, because the intellect relates to things at the relative level. In other words, everything that we understand, we always know we understand it to a certain degree. But we always sense that there is more to it. This is not the ultimate. This is not the end. And thus, it comes to a moment like Gimel Tamuz. And we are pronouncing, this comes, as I said, this comes right at us, the union, that we know and believe that Gimel Tamuz is not a fact. Gimel Tamuz is only a surface fact, but not a real fact. Why? Because the truth of the Rebbe, as we have experienced it, as we observed it, as we have related to it with our emunah, is beyond termination, beyond change. If it were a relative thing, if the Rebbe's presence were his intelligence, his goodness, his kindness, whatever, then you say, okay, there is something beyond it. But if it is something that is beyond relative value, then a relative change does not change it. The old person, this is something which I personally used to observe and always used to stand in awe, mamash, beyond just a simple observation. The latest years, the Rebbe was seemingly weak physically. Even when he made Kiddush many times by the table, by the upbringing, he used to assist. He used to assist with his left hand for the Kiddush cup. He used to pick up the Kiddush cup with the right hand, and with his left hand he used to push it up a little bit. He was weak. seemingly physically. And there was a little bit of a shake in the hand. Even in the writing, you could see that his writing was not perfectly straight the latest years. Right? So a man in that condition, then the Rebbe stands up and he's giving out Koshel Bracha. Giving out Koshel Bracha means that he would take wine in his cup and he would pour it in small whiskey cups and give him a chai. The Rebbe would stand there for hours, literally hours, and pour from his cup into these little cups. And some people had several cups in there, one hand, one lined up, one next to the other. And he would stand there and pour into these little cups. To the best of my observation, it never happened that he spilled a drop. This is a man whose hands are shaking, not shaking, but the shaking is weak. He couldn't even hold up the Kiddush cup easily. Then he's standing there and giving out little drops of wine in cups, one after the other, for hours on end, and not one drop spills out. You could readily see, although you don't understand it, but you can readily see that this is not a physical koyach. This is not just a physical action. Clearly there was a koyach that is completely unlimited, so to speak, not defined by the body. It was like the neshama acting through the body, completely disregarding the limitations of the body. And so, I felt it's important that we understand how we combine emunah with normal view of things, and that we should understand that every aspect of our emunah is not just closing my eyes and I'm saying what I need to say. No, it's I'm kind of giving up my intelligence at this moment. It's not that at all. This is why our emunah, people who don't know, who don't understand what emunah is, have all kinds of different ways of interpreting it. In very negative ways, in some cases. Particularly when it comes to such extreme statements as we're saying by Gimel Tamuz. And thus it's very important that we live with it. We understand that this is a living thing. That just as there is the simple intelligence, that which a person is able to understand on the relative level, meaning something that is true to a certain degree, to a certain level. He also has a neshama, and therefore he also has a perception and a knowledge and a conviction that of something which is beyond limit. And ultimately, he knows, and this is where the combination comes. Ultimately, we all know that even that which falls into the relative category, into the intellectual category, ultimately there is the real truth behind it, which is beyond the observable. This is illustrated in Torah by the following principle: that in the Aseres HaDibros, the Ten Commandments, which are the encapsulation of the whole Torah, and this is what essentially was given at Har Sinai at that moment of Matan Torah, but even what was written on the Aseres, on the tablets, it says Onoichi Hashem Elokecha, and it says at the end, Lo yisivtzach, lo yisignev, do not murder, do not steal, do not rob, do not have untoward desires, do not be jealous. That seems to be in a different world. Do not be jealous, do not steal, do not rob. These are relative truths. In other words, it's true even in the relative world, even on the observable world. Whereas Anoichi Hashem Elokecha, I am your God, Asher Tzich Mi'eretz Mitzrayim, is an eternal principle. How do these come together in the same place? And for this we are taught to explain this, that we have to understand that the simple truths of do not steal and do not rob actually are rooted, and to us even this is a principle, are rooted in the truth that that this is Hashem's world, and that we are serving Hashem. When we abstain from robbing somebody, when we abstain from lying or from doing anything untoward, anything wrong, we are not serving society, we're not being fine people, we are serving Hashem. In other words, the simple and most obvious, logically supported action is only logically identified, but its real principle and its real force to us is the emunah, is our perception of the absolute truth. And as a result of that, we can say, if we can say that don't steal and don't rob is a godly principle, not just a human principle, then we can also say that from a godly perspective, Gimel Tamuz is a surface, is an appearance. Because there is an absolute truth that completely defies this superficial observation. So that Gimel Tamuz and principles of this nature are both. On the one hand, it's very challenging. On the other hand, it actually elicits, it actually brings out, and it makes us think and recognize such deep insights, such truths, that otherwise we would never be able to relate to and see.
practically to relate this emuna, the level of emuna that we have, to the intellect level of perception that we have. I meant to say that, for example, let's say I have a feeling towards the fact that this cannot be like in Gimel Tamuz whatever, because like you said, right? But on the other hand, if I let's say to other person, or even say to myself, I would say, for example, that the Rebbe is alive, the Chai and the Kayim and all these things, terms that we use usually. And people usually, like let's say, to negate all that we just talked about. When we usually talk, we mean person life means life what he eats, he sleeps, and and then his opposite of life is opposite of life. So when you say like whatever happened on Gimel Tamuz looks like it's whatever, right? So when you say to such a person, Rebbe is alive. Alive means what? Opposite of what usual life is. Is it any other terms to relate to it? I mean, even though the feeling, I understand the feeling. I'm pretty sure that other people also have feelings. I mean, because you said it depends on the neshama. Every it has a neshama, so it relates to the concept inherently. To myself also.
The point of this discussion now is the following. You asked what does it mean the Rebbe is alive? Okay. What does it mean that you are alive? That you eat? That you sleep? That you walk? What does it mean? Excuse me?
When the Shama is in the body, that's what somebody go on. The soul of
The presence of the neshama. The presence of the neshama in the body. It's not, life is not the activities that you do, eating and sleeping. You're right that the question comes from the question comes from the observation, because at first glance we say alive, I know what it means.
To eat or sleep.
It means that I can run around.
Right.
Lahavdil, just like what's the life of an animal defined as?
Right.
It's a balchai, you can run from one end to the other.
Right.
But that's not the real meaning of living alive.
So that's what you should start to explain to yourself first of all, and to other people when talk to them. That's what the life is.
Yes.
So that's what is important.
Well,
I'm telling you.
but to explain that, you have to have that perception.
Also.
That's what I'm saying. That the reason we have that perception is because we have the emunah, we have that deeper perception, and we see that there are deeper truths than those that are defined by our observation.
But how do we transmit them from our perception to our, like koiches, the normal way we operate?
Our koiches are contradicted the minute you say there is a neshama.
So you think in no way to...
The minute you say that
our koiches
our koich, our seichel, from our koiches, seichel, midas, our observation. The minute you say there is a neshama, you never saw neshama. You saw the activity of the person, the body activity. That means that, as we spoke many times before, that means that you have to tell the koyach, listen, you are not the criterion for the truth. I am telling you what you see. The seichel, and then hide in the seichel, the emunah tells the eyes, here is what you are looking at. It's not the eyes telling the seichel and telling the neshama what you're seeing. It's the neshama telling the eyes what you're looking at.
That's how we look, then it's no problem.
That's what we're trying to do. It's not a question of no problem. No problem is there are many ways of making it no problem. I say you close your eyes, there's also no problem. What I'm trying to say is that we mustn't close our eyes. We must know that we must be intelligent people, full-fledged human beings, while we are saying these things, while we believe this. Not saying, we believe these things. And this is why these inyonim, like Gimel Tamuz, brings out the deepest and the best in us, rather than rendering us blind to reality. This is what it's about. It has to bring out real chayas. Yechi Adinenu Mereinu V'Rabbeinu Melech HaMoshiach Le'elam Roel.